Mr. Vincent Forest from the Frontline Defenders to update us about his situation and perhaps also about his wife, Liu Xiaobo, who is still under house arrest. Even this is not officially confirmed. Mr. Forest.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you for this opportunity given to Frontline Defenders and PEN International that I represent today as well. Because Liu Xiaobo was the president of the Independent Chinese PEN Center from 2003 and to 2007, 1 year before his arrest. Indeed, it's important to re-raise the case of Liu Xiaobo, particularly now because just a few days before the EU received the Nobel Peace Prize, it's important that the European Parliament and the EU marks the 4th anniversary of his imprisonment and the 2nd anniversary of the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to him, which, as we all remember, he was unable to accept in person. He was represented by an empty chair. And indeed, since then, since the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to him, his wife, who is also an artist, a painter and poet, Liu Xiaobo, she has been held under house arrest in her home in Beijing, and largely incommunicado. But Liu Xiaobo is not the only writer currently in jail in China. Last month, the novelist and poet Li Bifeng was sentenced to 12 years in prison, and in February it was the turn of the writer Zhu Yufu, who was sentenced to 7 years for a poem entitled It's Time. And the poem had been perceived by the Chinese authorities as subversive. And it reads, "It's time, Chinese people, it's time. The square belongs to all." And there are other cases of writers at risk included and detailed in our briefing paper that has been included in the meeting documents. So we are actually PEN International and Frontline Defenders. We have decided to launch a campaign, an international campaign, to gather video recordings of writers and poets around the world reading the Liu Xiaobo poetry. We believe it's a strong way to raise his case again. And the recordings are being uploaded onto a website, and they will be used as a basis for a series of actions and events to call for his immediate release. And so we urge the EU to reiterate the same call for his immediate release, including next week during the Nobel Peace Prize award ceremony. And to conclude, because it's quite symbolic, of course we call for his immediate release, but after 4 years in prison, 3 years after the sentence, and 2 years after the Nobel Peace Prize, I think it's also important to give a voice to him, who is voiceless for the moment. So I'd like to read, if I may, a few sentences from his court speech, "I have no enemies," because he was never allowed to be heard during his trial. So the text became actually the laureate's speech delivered at the Nobel Peace Prize award ceremony 2 years ago. "I have no enemies, but still, I want to say to this regime, which is depriving me of my freedom, that I stand by my convictions expressed in my June 2nd hunger strike declaration 20 years ago. I have no enemies and no hatred. None of the police who monitored, arrested and interrogated me, none of the prosecutors who indicted me, and none of the judges who judged me are my enemies. I have no enemies." Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Forest. And now our